The stagecoach had left her in a cloud of dust 3 hours ago, and Eliza was still trying to convince herself this wasn't a mistake. She stood at the edge of the Thornridge Ranch with nothing but a worn carpet bag, a letter of introduction that was looking increasingly worthless, and the kind of bone-deep exhaustion that comes from traveling 2,000 miles on hope and desperation. The Montana sky stretched overhead like a bruise, purple and gray and infinite, and the wind carried the smell of livestock, sage, and something else she couldn't name. Something that felt like warning. The ranch house sat in the distance, a sprawling structure of rough-hewn timber that looked more fortress than home. Outbuildings dotted the landscape like scattered teeth, and beyond them, the land rolled away in waves of brown grass and rocky soil that seemed to go on forever. It was beautiful in a hostile kind of way, the kind of beauty that didn't care if you appreciated it or not. Eliza had expected someone to meet her. The letter had been specific about the date and time. Instead, she'd been deposited at the property line like a piece of freight, and now she was walking the quarter-mile to the main house, with her bag getting heavier with every step. She was halfway there when she heard the horses. 3 riders came around the side of the barn, moving fast enough to kick up dirt, but not so fast they seemed rushed. They pulled up short when they saw her, and Eliza forced herself to keep walking even though everything in her body was screaming to stop, to make herself small, to disappear. The man in the middle dismounted first. He was broad-shouldered and sun-weathered, with the kind of face that had forgotten how to smile somewhere around his 40th year. His clothes were work-worn but clean, and he carried himself with the easy authority of someone who expected to be obeyed. "You the house girl?" he said. Not a greeting, not even a question, really. Just a flat statement of fact that somehow managed to sound like an accusation. Eliza stopped walking. She set her bag down carefully, buying herself a moment to breathe, and met his gaze. "Eliza Hartwell, I'm here about the position." "Position." He said the word like it tasted bad. "You're late." "The stage was delayed in Billings. There was a shot." "Don't care." He cut her off with the kind of casual cruelty that suggested he did this often. "I'm Ben Harker, ranch foreman. You work for me now." There was something in the way he said work that made Eliza's stomach clench. She'd heard that tone before back in Chicago, from men who thought a woman alone was the same thing as a woman available. "I was hired for domestic work," Eliza said carefully. "The advertisement specified." "Advertisement," Harker spat into the dirt. "You think we got time for advertisements out here? You think this is some kind of finishing school?" He gestured at the ranch spread out around them. "We need hands, real hands. If you can't pull your weight, you can get back on that stage." One of the other riders, a younger man with a nervous face, shifted in his saddle. "Ben, maybe we should—" "Shut it, Davies." Harker didn't even look at him. His eyes stayed fixed on Eliza, flat and measuring. "Well, you staying or going?" Eliza's hands were shaking. She curled them into fists so he wouldn't see. She'd used the last of her savings to get here. The stage back east wouldn't run again for a week, and even if it did, she didn't have the fare. There was nothing waiting for her in Chicago except a dead-end job in a factory that was slowly killing her from the inside out, and a landlord who'd made it clear that rent could be paid in more than one currency. This was supposed to be different. This was supposed to be safe. "I'm staying," she said. Harker smiled, and it was the worst thing Eliza had seen all day. "Good. Drop your bag at the bunkhouse. End of the row. Women's quarters. You start in the barn, mucking stalls, feeding, hauling water. Davies here will show you where the tools are." "The bunkhouse?" Eliza's voice came out sharper than she intended. "I was told I'd be working in the main house." "Things change." Harker swung back up onto his horse with the ease of someone who'd been doing it since childhood. "You got a problem with honest work?" It wasn't the work. Eliza had scrubbed floors and hauled laundry and done every kind of backbreaking labor that respectable women weren't supposed to acknowledge existed. But this, being reassigned without explanation, being spoken to like she was livestock, being watched by 3 men in the middle of nowhere with no one to hear her if she screamed, this felt wrong in a way she couldn't articulate. "No," she said quietly. "No problem." "Glad to hear it." Harker gathered his reins. "Sun's up at 5. You're not at the barn by 5:15. You don't eat. Clear?" Eliza nodded. "Good. Welcome to Thornridge Ranch, Miss Hartwell." He touched his hat brim in a mockery of courtesy and spurred his horse toward the house. The other two riders followed, except for Davies, who lingered long enough to give Eliza an apologetic look before riding off. Eliza stood there in the settling dust, watching them go, and felt the last of her optimism die a quiet death. The bunkhouse was exactly as grim as she'd imagined. It was a long, low building with a dirt floor and walls that let in more wind than they kept out. The women's section was separated from the men's by a thin partition that wouldn't stop sound or much else, and it smelled like sweat and old smoke and the kind of resignation that seeps into wood over years of hard use. There were 4 cots. 3 of them were clearly occupied, personal items scattered around, blankets rumpled from recent sleep. The 4th was bare except for a stained mattress that looked like it had been salvaged from somewhere worse. Eliza dropped her bag on it and sat down carefully. The frame creaked. A spring dug into her back. She didn't cry. She'd used up her crying somewhere around the Wyoming border when she'd realized that the West wasn't going to be the fresh start she'd been promised. It was just a different kind of cage with a bigger sky. She was still sitting there, staring at nothing, when the door banged open. The woman who walked in was maybe 35, with dark hair pulled back in a ruthless braid, and the kind of wiry build that came from years of hard work. She stopped when she saw Eliza, looked her up and down with the clinical assessment of someone used to measuring weakness, and grunted. "You the new girl?" It wasn't a question. "Eliza Hartwell," Eliza said. "Ruth Madeira." The woman moved to one of the other cots and started unlacing her boots. "You meet Harker yet?" "Yes." "Then you know what kind of place this is." Ruth pulled off one boot and dropped it on the floor with a thud. "Let me save you some trouble. Keep your head down, do what you're told, and don't go thinking anyone's coming to save you. Out here, you save yourself or you don't get saved." Eliza bristled. "I'm not looking to be saved." Ruth paused, the second boot halfway off, and looked at Eliza with something that might have been interest. "No? Then what are you looking for?" "Work, a roof, a chance to—" Eliza stopped, because the words "start over" sounded childish even in her own head. "A chance." Ruth finished removing her boot and leaned back against the wall. "Yeah, we all came here looking for chances. Funny how they turn out. How long have you been here?" 3 years. Ruth said it like a prison sentence. "Started out same as you. Advertisement, promises, respectable work. Harker put me in the fields after 2 weeks. Said I wasn't refined enough for the house." She smiled without humor. "Turned out I was too refined to keep my mouth shut when I saw him skimming supplies and pocketing the difference." Eliza's stomach dropped. "He's stealing from the ranch?" "Don't know if I'd call it stealing when nobody's paying attention." Ruth pulled a tin of tobacco from her pocket and started rolling a cigarette with practiced efficiency. "Owner's barely here, spends most of his time in Denver or San Francisco or wherever rich boys go when they get bored. Harker runs the place, and what Harker wants, Harker gets." "But someone must what? Care?" Ruth lit her cigarette and blew out a stream of smoke. "Look around, Hartwell. This isn't civilization. This is the place civilization gave up on. You want justice? You better pack it in your bag because you won't find it here." Eliza wanted to argue, wanted to believe that somewhere in this sprawling operation there was someone paying attention, someone who cared about more than profit margins and power. But Ruth's eyes were flat with the kind of truth that comes from experience, and Eliza had learned to recognize when she was being given a warning. "What about the other women?" she asked instead. "Maria's been here 5 years. Doesn't talk much. Lost her husband in a mine collapse back in Nevada. Came here because she didn't have anywhere else to go." Ruth gestured with her cigarette toward the empty cot. "Anna's new. 6 months. Keeps to herself. Smart girl." "And you?" Ruth studied her for a long moment. "I stay because leaving would mean admitting I wasted 3 years of my life. And because Harker may be a bastard, but at least he's a predictable bastard. I've worked worse places." Eliza didn't ask what could be worse than this. She was pretty sure she didn't want to know. "Get some sleep," Ruth said finally. "Bell rings at 4:30. You'll want to be dressed before the men start moving around. Walls are thin, and some of them haven't figured out what privacy means." She stubbed out her cigarette and rolled over, facing the wall. conversation over. Eliza lay down on her cot, still fully dressed, and stared at the ceiling. Through the gaps in the wood, she could see slivers of darkening sky. Somewhere in the distance, a horse whinnied. Closer, she could hear the low murmur of men's voices from the other side of the partition. She'd traveled 2,000 miles to trade one trap for another. But Ruth was wrong about one thing. Eliza wasn't here looking for chances. She was here because she'd run out of choices. And that was a different thing entirely. The bell that woke her at 4:30 was less a bell and more a piece of iron being beaten with a hammer, and it sounded like violence. Eliza jerked upright in the dark, disoriented and aching from a night spent on a mattress that felt like it was stuffed with rocks. Around her, the other women were already moving, Ruth with the efficient speed of long practice, Maria in silence, Anna with quick, nervous movements. 2 minutes to the privy, Ruth said without looking at her. Then you're on your own. Eliza stumbled outside into the pre-dawn cold. The privy was a wooden box 20 yards from the bunkhouse, and there was already a line of men waiting. They looked her over with varying degrees of interest as she joined the women's line, and Eliza kept her eyes fixed on the ground. By the time she made it back to the bunkhouse, the other women were gone. She pulled on her sturdiest dress, already a mistake, she realized, looking at the mud and manure she'd be walking through, and tied her hair back with shaking fingers. The barn was massive and dark and smelled like a living thing. Eliza stood in the doorway trying to get her bearings when someone shoved a pitchfork into her hands. Stalls. It was Davies, the nervous rider from yesterday. Up close, he looked younger than she'd thought, maybe 25, with pale eyes and the kind of sunburn that suggested he wasn't built for this climate. Start at the far end, work your way back. Wheel the muck out to the pile behind the building. You know how to work a wheelbarrow? Yes. He looked doubtful. Parker says you got until noon. After that, you're on fence repair. Eliza's hands tightened on the pitchfork. Where do I... But Davies was already walking away, leaving her alone in the half-light with 30 stalls and no idea where to start. She started at the far end, like he'd said. The first stall held a massive draft horse that eyed her with suspicion as she slipped inside. The floor was covered in soiled straw and manure, and the smell was overwhelming. Eliza jammed the pitchfork into the mess and tried to lift, but the tines caught on something and she nearly went sprawling. Behind her, someone laughed. She turned to find 2 ranch hands leaning against the stall door, watching her with the kind of amusement that made her skin crawl. Need some help there, sweetheart? The taller one said. He had a patchy beard and teeth that looked like they were staging a retreat from his gums. I'm fine. Eliza turned back to her work, ignoring the way her hands were already blistering. Don't look fine, the other one said. He was shorter, stockier, with small eyes and a mean smile. Looks like you never done a day's work in your life. Then it's a good thing I'm learning. Eliza heaved another forkful of muck into the wheelbarrow, her shoulders screaming in protest. What's your name? The tall one asked. Busy. Eliza didn't look at them. That's not friendly. He stepped into the stall, close enough that she could smell the tobacco on his breath. We're just trying to be neighborly. Eliza's grip tightened on the pitchfork. She was acutely aware of how isolated they were, how early in the morning it was, how no one would hear her if she screamed. But she was also aware that showing fear would be worse than whatever they were planning. Neighborly would be letting me work, she said evenly. The tall one opened his mouth to respond, but a voice cut through the barn like a whip. Monroe! Garrett! You got time to stand around. You got time to reshoe the plow team. The 2 men turned, and Eliza saw their expressions shift from predatory to resentful in an instant. The man standing in the barn doorway was backlit by the rising sun, which made it hard to make out his features, but his voice carried the kind of authority that didn't need volume. We were just... Monroe started. I don't care. The man stepped forward, and Eliza got her first clear look at him. He was younger than she'd expected, maybe 30, with dark hair that needed cutting, and a face that would have been handsome if it wasn't so serious. He was dressed like the ranch hands, work clothes, boots, a hat that had seen better days, but he carried himself differently, like he owned the space he stood in. Move, he said. Monroe and Garrett exchanged a look, but they moved. As they passed him, the tall one muttered something Eliza couldn't hear. The stranger didn't react, just watched them go with an expression that suggested he was filing the interaction away for future reference. Then he turned to Eliza. "You're the new hire." Another statement. Eliza was getting tired of people telling her who she was. "Eliza Hartwell," she said. "Caleb Thornridge." He said it like he expected her to recognize the name, and when she didn't react, something flickered across his face. "I own this ranch." Eliza's stomach dropped. Of all the ways she'd imagined meeting the ranch owner, this wasn't one of them. Standing ankle-deep in manure with blisters forming on her palms and two men who'd been seconds away from, what? Harassing her? Worse? Still within earshot. "Mr. Thornridge." She tried for something like professionalism and landed somewhere in the vicinity of exhausted formality. "I apologize for—" "Stop." He held up a hand. "Why are you in the barn?" Eliza blinked. "Your foreman, Mr. Harker, he assigned me to stall work." "Stall work?" Caleb looked around the barn like he was seeing it for the first time. "You were hired for domestic work." "Yes, but Mr. Harker said—" "What Harker says and what I hired you for are apparently two different things." He pulled off his hat and ran a hand through his hair, and for a moment he looked less like a ranch owner and more like someone who was very, very tired. "Come with me." "I haven't finished." "Now, Miss Hartwell." It wasn't a request. Eliza set down the pitchfork and followed him out of the barn, acutely aware of the eyes watching them from the shadows. Caleb moved with the long strides of someone used to covering ground quickly, and Eliza had to half-jog to keep up. He led her not to the main house, but to a smaller building tucked behind it. An office, she realized, stepping inside. The room was cramped and cluttered, with ledgers stacked on every surface and a desk that looked like it was being used as a burial ground for paperwork. Caleb closed the door and turned to face her. "How long have you been here?" he asked. "Since yesterday afternoon." "And Harker put you straight to field work?" "Yes." Something dangerous flickered in Caleb's eyes. Did he say why? Eliza hesitated. She'd spent her whole life learning to navigate the politics of men in power, learning when to speak and when to stay silent. But something about the way Caleb was looking at her, like he actually wanted to know the answer, made her tell the truth. "He said things had changed, that I needed to pull my weight or leave." "Changed?" Caleb's jaw tightened. "Nothing changed. I hired you 3 weeks ago to manage the household, cook, clean, handle the domestic side of the operation so I could focus on the ranch. That was the agreement." "Then why—" "Because Harker doesn't like being reminded that he's not the only one making decisions around here." Caleb moved to the desk and started shuffling through papers with barely controlled frustration. 3 months ago, I brought in a bookkeeper to audit the accounts. Harker ran him off in a week. 2 months ago, I hired a new cook because the men were complaining about the food. Harker had her on laundry duty within 3 days. And now you. He found what he was looking for. A letter, Eliza realized, in her own handwriting, and held it up. "You wrote that you had experience managing a boarding house in Chicago, 40 rooms, meals for 60, full staff oversight. That's why I hired you, not to shovel manure." Eliza stared at him. "I don't understand. If you're the owner, then I should be able to run my own ranch, yes." Caleb dropped the letter back on the desk. "Except I inherited this place 6 months ago from an uncle I barely knew, and I've been trying to figure out which end is up ever since. Harker's been here 15 years. The men listened to him, and I've been—" He stopped, seeming to catch himself. "I've been trying to learn the operation before I start making changes." "By letting him reassign your staff?" The words came out sharper than Eliza intended, but Caleb didn't look offended. If anything, he looked almost relieved. "No," he said quietly. "That stops today." He moved to the door and opened it, calling out to someone Eliza couldn't see. A moment later, a young man appeared. Not Davies, someone else, with red hair and freckles that made him look about 16. "Tommy, go find Harker. Tell him I need to see him in my office. Now." Tommy's eyes widened. "Sir, he's—" "Now, Tommy." The kid took off at a run. Caleb closed the door and turned back to Eliza. "Here's what's going to happen. I'm going to make it clear to Harker that you work for me, not him, and that your duties are what I hired you for. You'll move into the house. There's a room off the kitchen that the previous housekeeper used. You'll handle meals, basic housekeeping, and he paused, studying her. You said you managed accounts at the boarding house? Yes. Payroll, supply orders, basic bookkeeping? Good, because mine are a disaster, and I could use someone who knows what they're looking at. Eliza's mind was racing. This was everything she'd hoped for when she'd answered the advertisement. Respectable work, a room in the main house, actual use for the skills she'd spent years developing. But there was something in the set of Caleb's shoulders, the tightness around his eyes, that suggested this wasn't going to be as simple as it sounded. Mr. Thornridge, she said carefully, if your foreman has been here 15 years and you've been here 6 months, reassigning me is going to create problems. It already has created problems. I'm just done pretending otherwise. But the men work for me. His voice was flat. They don't have to like it, but they're going to respect it. Eliza wanted to believe him. Wanted to believe that authority and ownership meant something out here. That the rules of civilization applied even in the middle of nowhere. But she'd seen the way Monroe and Garrett had looked at her. The way Harker had smiled when he'd assigned her to the barn. What if they don't? She asked quietly. Caleb met her eyes, and for the first time since she'd arrived, Eliza saw something in them that wasn't exhaustion or frustration. It was resolve. Then they can find work somewhere else, he said. What? Harker arrived 10 minutes later, and the temperature in the room dropped 20 degrees. He stood in the doorway, not quite entering, and his eyes moved from Caleb to Eliza and back again, calculating. You wanted to see me, he said. Close the door. Caleb didn't sit down, didn't offer Harker a seat, just stood there with his arms crossed, radiating a kind of quiet authority that Eliza hadn't seen in him before. Harker closed the door, slowly. Miss Hartwell tells me you reassigned her to stall work, Caleb said. We needed hands in the barn. Harker's voice was neutral, almost bored. She's got 2 of them. She was hired for domestic work. Domestic work can wait, ranch work can't. That's not your decision to make. Something flickered across Harker's face. Surprise, maybe, or annoyance. With respect, Mr. Thornridge, I've been running this operation for 15 years, I know. Caleb's voice was quiet, but there was steel underneath it. And you've done a good job keeping things running while my uncle was alive and while I've been learning the ropes. But I'm not learning anymore. This is my ranch, and my decisions stand. Harker's jaw tightened. Your uncle trusted me to... My uncle is dead. The words hung in the air like a challenge. And I'm not my uncle. Miss Hartwell will be working in the house, managing the household, and assisting with the accounts. You'll assign someone else to the barn. We're short-handed as it is. Then hire more hands, but this one's mine. The silence that followed was the kind that precedes violence. Eliza found herself holding her breath, waiting for Harker to push back, to escalate, to force Caleb into a confrontation that would determine who really ran this ranch. But Harker was smarter than that. He smiled, that same cold, empty smile from yesterday, and nodded. Of course. Your ranch, your rules. He touched his hat brim in mock deference. Will that be all? That's all. Harker opened the door, paused, and looked back at Eliza. Enjoy the house, Miss Hartwell. I'm sure you've earned it. Then he was gone, leaving behind the kind of quiet that feels like a held breath. Caleb exhaled slowly and rubbed his face with both hands. That went better than I expected. Better? Eliza stared at him. He looked like he wanted to kill me? Probably. Caleb dropped his hands and met her eyes. But he didn't, which means he's still deciding whether I'm worth the trouble. That buys us time. Time for what? For you to prove you're worth the fight I just picked. He moved to the desk and pulled out a ledger that looked like it hadn't been opened in months. Can you start today? Eliza looked at the ledger, at the office full of neglected paperwork, at the man who'd just put his authority on the line for a woman he'd met 5 minutes ago. She thought about Ruth's warning, about Harker's smile, about the way this place seemed to operate on its own set of rules that had nothing to do with fairness or justice. She thought about saying no, about getting back on that stage and finding somewhere else, somewhere safer, somewhere that didn't feel like standing on the edge of a cliff. But she'd been running for too long. And Caleb Thornridge, for all his youth and inexperience, had just done something no man had done for her in years. He'd asked what she wanted. "I can start now," she said. Caleb smiled, a real smile this time, small and tired and genuine. "Good. Let me show you to your room." The room off the kitchen was small but clean, with a real bed, a window that looked out over the vegetable garden, and a door that locked from the inside. Eliza stood in the doorway, taking it in, and felt something in her chest loosen for the first time in months. "Previous housekeeper left some things behind," Caleb said, gesturing at the dresser. "Linens, some kitchen equipment. You're welcome to whatever's useful." He paused. "Meals are at 6, noon, and 7. You'll be cooking for me and whatever hands are around, usually 4 or 5. We're not fancy." "I can manage that." "I know you can. That's why you're here." He moved toward the door, then stopped. "Miss Hartwell." "Eliza, I need you to understand something. What happened in that barn this morning with Monroe and Garrett, that's not going to be the last time someone tests you." "I know. And I can't be there every time." His voice was quiet, almost apologetic. "I can give you the authority, but you're going to have to enforce it yourself. If that's not something you're comfortable with—" "Mr. Thornridge," Eliza cut him off gently, "I didn't come 2,000 miles to be comfortable. I came here to work. And if that work includes reminding your men that I'm not decoration, then that's what I'll do." Caleb studied her for a long moment, and something in his expression shifted. Respect, maybe, or recognition. "Caleb," he said finally, "if we're going to be working together, you should call me Caleb." "Eliza, then." He nodded, touched his hat brim, a gesture that somehow felt different when he did it, and left. Eliza closed the door behind him and leaned against it, letting herself breathe. Through the window, she could hear the sounds of the ranch waking up fully, horses being led out to pasture, men shouting instructions, the creak of wagon wheels on hard-packed dirt. Beyond that, the vast silence of the frontier, empty and indifferent. She'd won the first battle. She'd gotten the job she'd been promised, the room she'd been denied, the basic respect that should have been automatic but had required a fight. But Ruth's words echoed in her head. This is the place civilization gave up on. And Ben Harker's smile, cold and patient. "Enjoy the house, Miss Hartwell. I'm sure you've earned it." This wasn't over. This was barely beginning. Eliza pushed away from the door and started unpacking her bag. She had work to do, accounts to examine, a household to run. And somewhere out there, Harker was deciding what his next move would be. She'd face that when it came. She'd faced worse. At least that's what she told herself as she hung up her only other dress and tried not to think about how far she was from anywhere that felt like safety. The frontier didn't care about comfort. It didn't care about fair fights or second chances. But Eliza Hartwell was done running. And if this land wanted to test her, she'd show it what a woman with nothing left to lose could do. The first meal Eliza cooked in the Thornridge kitchen was supposed to be simple. Beef stew, cornbread, coffee strong enough to strip paint. The kind of food that filled bellies without asking questions. But the moment she opened the pantry, she knew nothing about this place was going to be simple. Half the supplies were missing or spoiled. The flour had weevils. The salt pork looked like it had been there since before Caleb inherited the ranch. And the ledger she found tucked behind a sack of beans told a story that made her stomach turn. Someone had been skimming. Not just a little, a lot. She was still staring at the numbers when Caleb walked in, hat in hand, looking like he'd spent the morning wrestling cattle or the frontier itself. "How bad is it?" he asked. Eliza looked up. "The kitchen or the books?" "Both." She set down the ledger and wiped her hands on her apron. "Kitchen needs a complete restock. Half of what's here isn't fit for human consumption. The books—" She paused, choosing her words carefully. "When was the last time you actually looked at your supply orders?" Caleb's jaw tightened. "I sign off on them every month. Harker handles the details." "Then Harker's been handling himself to about 30% more than what's actually arriving." Eliza turned the ledger around so he could see. "Look, last month's order shows 200 pounds of flour, 50 pounds of coffee, 40 pounds of sugar. But what's in that pantry couldn't account for more than half that, and I'm being generous." Caleb stared at the numbers like they were written in a language he didn't speak. Then he swore, low and vicious, and ran a hand through his hair. How long? I'd need to see the previous ledgers to know for sure, but based on the date stamps in this one, at least 6 months, probably longer. That son of a... He stopped himself, glanced at Eliza, and seemed to remember where he was. I'm sorry, this isn't... I didn't bring you here to deal with this. You brought me here to manage the household, Eliza said quietly. This is the household, and if someone's stealing from it, that's something I need to know. Caleb looked at her for a long moment, and something shifted in his expression, not quite trust, but something close. Can you prove it? If I can see the invoices from the suppliers and cross-reference them with what was actually delivered, yes. But that's going to take time, and it's going to be obvious what I'm doing. Let it be obvious. Caleb's voice was flat. I'm done pretending this place runs itself. He left to find the invoices, and Eliza turned back to the stove where the stew was starting to burn. She grabbed a spoon and stirred, her mind racing. This was bigger than reassigning staff or kitchen supplies. This was theft, systematic and deliberate, and confronting it meant going to war with a man who'd already made it clear he didn't like being challenged. But that was a problem for after lunch. Right now, she had 5 ranch hands about to walk through that door expecting food, and she'd be damned if her first meal was a disaster. The men arrived at noon exactly, tracking mud across the floor Eliza had just scrubbed, and bringing with them the smell of horses and sweat. They filled the long table in awkward silence, eyeing Eliza like she was a puzzle they couldn't solve. She served the stew without comment, set out the cornbread, and poured coffee that could wake the dead. Then she stepped back and waited. The first man to try it was older, maybe 50, with a gray beard and the kind of weathered face that suggested he'd seen everything twice. He took a bite, chewed slowly, and grunted. Better than the slop we've been eating, he said. It wasn't exactly a compliment, but Eliza would take it. The others dug in, and the tension in the room eased slightly. Not gone, just shifted. Less hostility, more caution. Caleb came in last, still carrying the box of invoices, and took his seat at the head of the table. He didn't say anything, just started eating, but his presence changed the dynamic. The men sat up straighter, talked less, kept their eyes on their plates. Eliza refilled coffee and tried not to stare at the box of invoices sitting next to Caleb's elbow. Inside were answers. Evidence. The kind of ammunition that could either fix this place or blow it apart. One of the younger hands, the red-haired kid, Tommy, cleared his throat. Miss Hartwell, this is real good. Best we've had in a while. Thank you, Tommy. Previous cook couldn't make cornbread worth a damn, another man added. Tasted like sawdust. That's because it was half sawdust, the older man said. Harker told her to stretch the meal budget. Guess he didn't tell her how. The table went quiet. Too quiet. Like everyone had suddenly remembered they weren't supposed to be talking about this. Caleb set down his fork. Where is Harker? Rode out to check fence lines, Tommy said quickly. Said he'd be back before dark. Good. Caleb picked up his fork again. That gives us time. The men exchanged glances, but nobody asked what he meant. They just ate faster and left quicker than Eliza suspected was normal, until it was just her and Caleb and a table full of dirty dishes. They're scared of him, Eliza said. They're scared of change. Caleb pushed his plate away and pulled the box of invoices toward him. Harker's been running things his way for so long, they don't know what happens if someone pushes back. Do you? He looked up at her, and for a moment she saw past the authority and the ownership to the man underneath. Young. Uncertain. Trying like hell not to show it. No, he said honestly, but I'm about to find out. They spent the afternoon in the office, spreading invoices across every available surface and cross-referencing them with the ledger entries. It was tedious work, the kind that made Eliza's eyes ache and her back complain, but it was also damning. For every order Caleb had signed off on, the actual delivery was 30 to 40% short. And the pattern was consistent across everything: flour, coffee, sugar, salt, tools, leather, nails, even the hay for the horses. Harker had been skimming from every supplier every month for at least 2 years. How much? Caleb's voice was tight. Eliza did the math in her head, double-checked it on paper, and felt sick. Conservatively? About $6,000. Caleb went very still. 6,000. That's just what I can prove from these invoices. If he's been doing this longer, he has been. Caleb stood up and walked to the window, staring out at the ranch like he was seeing it for the first time. My uncle wrote to me before he died, said the ranch was struggling, that expenses were high and profits were down. I thought he was just old and tired. I thought... He stopped, his hands curling into fists. I should have known. How could you? Eliza stood up, her legs protesting after hours of sitting. You weren't here. And Harker's been covering his tracks well enough that your uncle never caught on either. My uncle was dying. He wasn't paying attention to anything except staying alive long enough to see me inherit. Caleb turned back to her. But I'm here now, and I'm paying attention. What are you going to do? Confront him, tonight when he gets back. Eliza's stomach dropped. Caleb, if you accuse him without a plan, I have a plan. I fire him. And then what? The men listen to him. If he walks, half of them might walk with him. Then I hire new men. In the middle of the season, when every other ranch is already staffed? Eliza moved closer, keeping her voice low, even though they were alone. I know you want to fix this, so do I. But if you move too fast, you'll lose more than a foreman. Caleb's jaw worked. So what do you suggest? Document everything, every discrepancy, every missing supply, every invoice that doesn't match. Build a case so airtight he can't talk his way out of it. Then confront him in front of witnesses. The men need to see that this isn't personal, it's business. That could take weeks. Better weeks than losing your ranch trying to win a battle in one night. Caleb stared at her, and Eliza could see him wrestling with it. The need for justice versus the reality of power. The desire to act versus the wisdom of patience. It was the same calculation she'd been making her whole life, and it never got easier. All right, he said finally. We do it your way. But Eliza... Yes? If he figures out what we're doing, this gets dangerous fast for both of us. Eliza thought about Harker's smile, about Monroe and Garrett in the barn, about Ruth's warning that civilization had given up on this place. I know, she said. That night, Harker came back late and went straight to the bunkhouse without stopping at the main house. Eliza watched from her window as his silhouette crossed the yard, and she tried not to think about what would happen when he found out she was digging into his books. She slept badly, waking at every sound, and was already in the kitchen when the morning bell rang. The routine was the same. Breakfast at 6, men filing in with mud and expectation, food served and eaten in relative silence. But Harker was there this time, sitting at the far end of the table, watching her with those flat, calculating eyes. Miss Hartwell, he said as she poured his coffee. Settling in all right? Yes, thank you. Good, good. He took a sip, never breaking eye contact. Heard you've been spending time in the office, helping Mr. Thornridge with the books. Eliza's hand didn't shake, but it wanted to. He asked me to review the household accounts. Make sure we're ordering efficiently. Efficient? That's a fine word. Harker smiled. Your predecessor wasn't much for numbers, preferred to leave that sort of thing to the men who understood it. Then it's lucky Mr. Thornridge found someone who does. The temperature in the room dropped. The other men kept eating, but Eliza could feel them listening, waiting to see how this played out. Harker set down his cup very carefully. Just make sure you understand what you're looking at, Miss Hartwell. Books can be complicated. Easy to make mistakes if you don't know the context. I'll keep that in mind. You do that. He stood up, leaving half his breakfast untouched. Thornridge in the office? I believe so. Harker nodded and walked out, and Eliza had to force herself to keep moving, keep serving, keep pretending her heart wasn't trying to beat its way out of her chest. After breakfast, she found Caleb in the office, staring at a new stack of papers with the kind of focus that suggested he'd been there since before dawn. He knows, Eliza said quietly. Caleb didn't look up. I know he knows. He came in here 20 minutes ago asking about supply orders for next month. Wanted to know if we were making any changes to the usual routine. What did you tell him? That I was reviewing everything and I'd let him know. Caleb finally looked up and his eyes were hard. He didn't like that. What did he say? Nothing. That's what worries me. Caleb stood and moved to the window, the same position he'd taken yesterday. Men who yell, you can handle. Men who go quiet are planning something. Eliza joined him at the window. Outside, the ranch was in full swing, horses being exercised, equipment being repaired, the endless work of keeping a place like this running. It looked almost peaceful from here, almost normal. How long until you have enough evidence? Caleb asked. Another week, maybe less if I can get access to the supplier correspondence. It's in the filing cabinet, bottom drawer. He glanced at her. Be careful with it. Some of those letters go back years. If Harker notices they've been moved, I'll be careful. They stood there for a moment, watching the ranch, and Eliza was struck by how strange this was. A week ago, she'd been alone in Chicago, answering an advertisement with no idea what she was walking into. Now she was standing next to a man she barely knew, planning to take down his foreman, and somehow it felt like the most honest work she'd done in years. Eliza, Caleb said quietly, why did you really come west? She could have lied. Could have given him the sanitized version about seeking opportunity and fresh starts, but they were past that now. I was tired of being invisible, she said. In Chicago, I was just another woman trying to survive in a city that didn't care if I lived or died. I wanted to go somewhere I could matter, where what I did made a difference. And is it making a difference? Eliza thought about the kitchen she'd cleaned, the books she was untangling, the small acts of competence that were slowly shifting the balance of power in this place. Yes, she said. I think it is. Caleb nodded slowly. Good, because I need you to keep mattering. This ranch... He stopped, searching for words. My uncle built this place from nothing, and I'll be damned if I let someone steal it out from under me because I was too inexperienced to see what was happening. You're seeing it now. Only because you showed me. They looked at each other, and something passed between them that Eliza couldn't quite name. Not quite friendship, not quite partnership, but something that felt like the beginning of both. The moment broke when Tommy burst through the door, breathing hard. Mr. Thornridge, you need to come quick. There's been an accident. Caleb was moving before Tommy finished the sentence. What happened? One of the fence posts broke, caught Garrett in the leg. He's bleeding bad. They ran. Garrett was on the ground near the north pasture, his leg bent at an angle that made Eliza's stomach turn. Monroe was trying to stop the bleeding with his shirt, but the fabric was already soaked through. The other men stood around in a loose circle, useless and panicked. Caleb dropped to his knees next to Garrett. How bad? Broke through the skin, Monroe said, and for once he wasn't sneering or making threats. He just looked scared. Needs a doctor. Nearest doctor is 2 hours away. Caleb looked up at Tommy. Ride hard. Tell him we'll pay double if he gets here fast. Tommy took off at a run. Caleb turned to Eliza. Can you help? She'd never set a broken leg in her life, but she'd seen it done. I'll need clean cloth, hot water, and something for him to bite on. The men scattered to find supplies, and Eliza knelt next to Garrett. Up close, she could see he was barely conscious, his face gray with shock. Garrett, she said firmly, can you hear me? He nodded weakly. Good. This is going to hurt, but I need you to stay still. Can you do that? Another nod. Caleb moved to Garrett's other side. Tell me what you need. What Eliza needed was a medical degree and a proper operating room, but what she had was a field, a broken man, and 2 hours to keep him alive until real help arrived. Hold his shoulders, she said. Don't let him move. She worked quickly, cleaning the wound as best she could and wrapping it tight to slow the bleeding. The bone wasn't protruding, which was something, but the leg was definitely broken and possibly fractured in multiple places. When she tried to straighten it, Garrett screamed despite the leather strap between his teeth. I'm sorry, she whispered. I'm sorry, but I have to... Do it, Caleb said quietly. He knows. Eliza set the leg as straight as she could manage and splinted it with fence posts and torn cloth. It wasn't pretty, and it probably wasn't right, but it was better than nothing. By the time she finished, her hands were shaking and Garrett had passed out. Will he make it? Monroe asked. If the doctor gets here in time and the leg doesn't get infected... Eliza sat back on her heels, exhausted. After that, it's up to him. The men stood there in silence, looking at Garrett, at Eliza, at Caleb. Something had shifted. Eliza could feel it in the way they watched her, less like an intruder, more like someone who'd earned her place through action instead of words. Caleb stood and addressed them directly. Monroe, stay with him, keep him warm, and keep talking to him. Don't let him slip too deep. The rest of you, back to work. We've still got a ranch to run." They moved, but slower than usual, less certain. The accident had rattled them in a way that went beyond Garrett's injury. Caleb pulled Eliza aside as the men dispersed. "You did good." "I did what I could. It might not be enough. It's more than anyone else here could have done." He looked at her hands, still stained with blood. "Go clean up. I'll handle things here." Eliza walked back to the house in a daze. Her dress was ruined, her hands wouldn't stop shaking, and somewhere in the middle of setting a broken leg in a field, she'd crossed a line she couldn't uncross. These people were starting to depend on her, not just Caleb, but the men. Even Monroe, who'd looked at her with something like gratitude when she'd finished with Garrett. She was becoming part of this place, and that terrified her more than anything Harker could do. The doctor arrived 2 hours later, examined Garrett, and confirmed that Eliza had probably saved his life. The leg would heal crooked and he'd walk with a limp, but he'd walk. That was more than anyone had expected. Word spread fast. By dinner, every hand on the ranch knew that the new housekeeper had set a broken leg in the field without flinching. The men who'd been watching her with suspicion started watching with something closer to respect. But respect was a double-edged blade out here, and Eliza knew it. That night she was in the kitchen cleaning up after dinner when she heard footsteps behind her. She turned to find Ruth standing in the doorway, arms crossed. "Heard what you did today," Ruth said. "News travels fast." "Always does." Ruth stepped into the kitchen and lowered her voice. "You need to be careful, Hartwell. Harker doesn't like it when people make him look useless. And saving Garrett? That made him look real useless. I wasn't trying to make anyone look like anything. I was trying to keep a man from bleeding out." "I know, but intent doesn't matter out here. Results do." Ruth glanced toward the door, making sure they were alone. "He's going to push back. I don't know when or how, but he will. And when he does, Thornridge might not be able to protect you." "I'm not asking to be protected." "Then you're a fool." Ruth's voice was flat. "This isn't Chicago. You can't just report someone to the authorities or find a new job. Out here, if someone wants you gone, you're gone. And Harker wants you gone." Eliza's hands tightened on the dish towel. "Let him try." Ruth studied her for a long moment, then shook her head. "You got guts. I'll give you that. Just make sure you got a plan to go with them." She left, and Eliza stood alone in the kitchen, listening to the sounds of the ranch settling in for the night. Somewhere out there, Harker was planning his next move. And somewhere closer, Caleb was probably still in his office, trying to figure out how to run a ranch that seemed determined to run itself into the ground. Eliza dried her hands and locked the kitchen door behind her. Tomorrow, she'd start going through the supplier correspondence. She'd build the case against Harker one piece of paper at a time, and she'd do it carefully enough that he wouldn't see it coming until it was too late. But tonight, she let herself admit what she'd been avoiding since she'd arrived. This wasn't just about proving herself anymore. It wasn't about finding respectable work or making a fresh start. She cared about this place, about the ranch, about the people trying to make it work, about Caleb and his quiet determination to do right by something he'd barely understood 6 months ago. And that caring was going to get her hurt. Maybe worse than hurt. But she'd come too far to turn back now. The frontier didn't forgive mistakes, and it didn't care about good intentions. But Eliza Hartwell was done living small. She was done being invisible. If this place wanted to test her, she'd show it what a woman with something to fight for could do. And if Harker wanted a war, she'd give him one he'd never forget. The war started small, the way most wars do, with things going missing. First it was kitchen supplies. A sack of flour that should have lasted 2 weeks was gone in 5 days. Then the good knives disappeared from the drawer, replaced with dull blades that couldn't cut butter. The coffee turned out to be half chicory, stretched so thin it tasted like dirty water, and when Eliza went to check the invoices, she found pages missing from the ledger. Not torn out, just gone, like they'd never existed. She was standing in the office, staring at the gaps in the record book, when Caleb walked in covered in dust from a day spent moving cattle. "He's erasing the evidence," she said without preamble. Caleb closed the door behind him and moved to look over her shoulder. "You're sure?" "Last week there were invoices here dating back 18 months. Now everything before March is gone." Eliza turned to face him, keeping her voice level even though her hands wanted to shake. He knows what we're doing, and he's covering his tracks. Caleb swore and turned away, pacing the small office like a caged animal. Did you make copies? Of some of it. Not enough. Eliza set down the ledger carefully, like it might bite. The correspondence files are still intact. I've been going through them at night, documenting the discrepancies. But without the original invoices, we can still prove a pattern. Suppliers will have their own records, if they're willing to provide them. And if Harker hasn't already gotten to them first. Caleb stopped pacing and looked at her, really looked at her, and Eliza saw the exhaustion there, the weight of trying to hold together something that wanted to fall apart. I'm sorry, he said quietly. I brought you into this mess. You should be running a household, not fighting a war with my foreman. The household is the war. Eliza crossed her arms, more to keep herself steady than anything else. You can't separate them. Not here. I could fire him, today. Right now. And lose half your crew before the week's out. We've been over this. So what, we just let him steal and sabotage until we have enough evidence? How much is that going to cost me? Less than losing the ranch entirely. Eliza moved closer, lowering her voice even though they were alone. Caleb, I know this is hard. I know you want to fix it fast, but if you move now, you lose everything. The men, the operation, maybe even the land if word gets out that you can't control your own ranch. He turned away from her, bracing his hands on the desk. My uncle ran this place for 30 years. How did he not see this? Maybe he did see it. Maybe he just decided it was easier to let Harker take his cut than to fight. Eliza paused. Or maybe he was tired, sick, dying, and Harker took advantage. That makes it worse. I know. They stood there in silence, and Eliza could feel the frustration radiating off him in waves. She understood it. She felt it too. The slow burn of injustice, the need to act, to do something instead of carefully documenting theft while watching supplies disappear. But she'd learned patience the hard way, in boarding houses and factories, in places where one wrong move meant losing everything. Caleb was still learning, and learning fast could get you killed out here. How much longer? He asked finally. 2 weeks. Maybe 3. I need to cross-reference the supplier correspondence with what's left of the ledgers and build a timeline that's airtight. Then we confront him in front of the crew, show them exactly what he's been doing, and give them a choice. Stay and work for an honest operation, or follow Harker somewhere else. And if they choose Harker, then at least you'll know where you stand. Caleb straightened up and turned back to her. His eyes were hard, but there was something else there too. Trust, maybe. Or faith that she knew what she was doing, even when he didn't. All right, he said. 2 weeks. But Eliza, if he escalates, if this gets dangerous, it's already dangerous. We're just choosing which danger we're willing to live with. He opened his mouth to respond, but footsteps outside the office made them both freeze. A shadow passed the window, paused, then kept walking. Not Harker's gait. Someone lighter. Faster. When the footsteps faded, Caleb exhaled slowly. We need to be more careful. I know. No more meetings in the office during the day. Too exposed. Then where? He thought for a moment. There's a line shack about 2 miles north. No one uses it this time of year. We can meet there after dark, go over the evidence away from prying eyes. Eliza's stomach twisted. Meeting a man alone at night in an isolated cabin was exactly the kind of thing that could destroy a woman's reputation, if anyone found out. But her reputation had already been stretched thin just by being here, working alongside men, refusing to stay in her assigned place. All right, she said. But we alternate nights. Make it look random, less chance someone notices a pattern. Caleb nodded. Tomorrow night. I'll leave after dinner. Make it look like I'm checking the north fence. You follow an hour later. How will I find it in the dark? Follow the creek bed north until you hit a stand of cottonwoods. The shack's just beyond it. There's a lamp inside. I'll light it so you can see. Eliza tried not to think about all the ways this could go wrong. All right, tomorrow night. They separated carefully, Caleb leaving first, Eliza waiting 5 minutes before following. By the time she made it back to the kitchen, her heart was racing and her hands were cold despite the heat from the stove. She was in too deep now. There was no going back to simple housekeeping and staying invisible. She'd chosen a side, and that side was putting her in isolated cabins with a man she barely knew, building a case against someone who'd already proven he was willing to steal and lie. But the alternative was watching this place crumble while she scrubbed floors and pretended not to notice. And Eliza was done pretending. That night at dinner, Harker was watching her again. Not obviously, he never did anything obviously, but she could feel his eyes tracking her movements as she served, as she poured, as she cleaned, like he was waiting for her to make a mistake. The men ate quickly and left quicker, until it was just Harker and Caleb at opposite ends of the table, the space between them heavy with unspoken confrontation. "Heard you're planning to ride the north fence tomorrow," Harker said casually, checking for damage after that storm last week. Caleb didn't look up from his plate. "That's right. I can send Davies. No need for you to ride out in this heat. I prefer to see things myself." "Suit yourself." Harker stood, leaving half his food untouched like always. "Just seems like a waste of time is all. That fence is solid. I checked it myself 3 days ago." "Then it won't take long to confirm." Harker smiled that cold smile and touched his hat brim. "Night, boss. Miss Hartwell." He left, and the silence he left behind felt like a held breath. Eliza started clearing plates, hyper-aware of Caleb still sitting at the table, both of them knowing they couldn't talk here, couldn't plan here, couldn't even look at each other too long without it seeming suspicious. "The stew was good tonight," Caleb said quietly. "Thank you. My uncle used to say that a well-run ranch starts with a well-fed crew." "Your uncle was right." Caleb stood, carrying his plate to the kitchen counter instead of leaving it on the table like the other men did. "Get some rest, Eliza. Tomorrow's going to be a long day." It was the most normal thing he could have said, and also a reminder. Tomorrow night, the line shack. Evidence and planning and risk. "You too," she said. He left and Eliza finished cleaning in the quiet. Through the window, she could see lights in the bunkhouse, hear the low murmur of voices. The ranch settling in for the night, unaware that its foundation was cracking. She locked the kitchen door and went to her room, but she didn't sleep. Instead, she pulled out the correspondence files she'd been hiding under her mattress and worked by candlelight, documenting every discrepancy, every missing order, every lie buried in business casual language. By the time exhaustion finally pulled her under, it was past midnight and her eyes burned from reading bad handwriting by bad light. But she had names now, suppliers who'd been shorted, dates that didn't match, a pattern so clear that even men who wanted to look the other way wouldn't be able to ignore it. 2 more weeks. She could last 2 more weeks. The next day dragged. Eliza went through the motions of breakfast, cleaning, preparation for dinner, but her mind was already in the line shack, rehearsing what she'd say, what she'd show Caleb, how they'd proceed. Caleb left after the noon meal like he'd said, riding north with a casual wave that fooled no one who was paying attention. Harker watched him go from the barn, then disappeared inside. The other men went back to work. The ranch kept turning like a machine that didn't care who was running it. Eliza waited. An hour felt like 10. She prepared dinner early, left instructions for the men to serve themselves, and slipped out the back door as the sun was starting to set. The creek bed was easy enough to find, a dry channel cutting through the landscape like a scar. She followed it north, her boots slipping on loose stones, her heart hammering every time she heard a sound that might be footsteps. But no one followed her. The land was empty except for the wind and the fading light and the distant cry of a hawk circling overhead. The cottonwoods appeared like ghosts in the twilight, their white bark catching the last of the sun. And beyond them, just visible in the gathering dark, was a small structure with light bleeding through the gaps in its walls. Eliza approached carefully, knocked once, and pushed open the door. The line shack was barely more than 4 walls and a roof, with a dirt floor and a single window covered by a piece of oiled cloth. Caleb had lit a lamp and set it on an overturned crate that served as a table. He looked up when she entered, and some of the tension in his shoulders eased. "Any trouble?" he asked. "No, you?" Harker was watching when I left, but he didn't follow. Caleb gestured to another crate. "Sit. We don't have much time before someone notices we're both gone." Eliza sat and pulled out the papers she'd brought, spreading them across the makeshift table. I've got correspondence from 3 suppliers dating back 2 years. All of them confirm short deliveries. And look at this. She pointed to a letter from a feed supplier in Billings. He specifically mentions that he's been delivering short on Harker's orders and that the difference is being delivered to a secondary location. Caleb leaned forward, reading by lamplight. A secondary location, where? Doesn't say. But if we can find out, we can prove he's not just skimming, he's actively running a side operation. Caleb sat back, running a hand through his hair. That's enough to ruin him, more than enough. It's enough to prove theft, but we still need to show the men that this affects them, not just you. The supplies he's stealing, that's food out of their mouths, equipment they need to do their jobs safely. Make it personal, and they'll turn on him. You're good at this, Caleb said quietly. At what? Strategy. Seeing angles I don't. He looked at her, and in the lamplight his face was all shadows and sharp edges. You should have been running companies, not boarding houses. Eliza felt heat creep up her neck. Companies don't hire women to run them. They hire us to clean up after the men who do. Then they're fools. They worked through the rest of the papers, documenting everything, building their case piece by piece. It was meticulous work, boring in its detail, but there was something almost intimate about it. 2 people bent over bad handwriting in a drafty shack, building something that mattered. An hour passed. Then another. Eliza was in the middle of cross-referencing an invoice when Caleb spoke. Can I ask you something? She looked up. Yes? Why are you really doing this? You could walk away. Find work somewhere safer, somewhere you're not caught between me and Harker. Eliza set down her pen carefully. I told you. I came here to matter. You matter in Chicago. You mattered wherever you were before. No. The word came out harder than she intended. I survived. That's not the same thing. She looked down at her hands, ink-stained and calloused. My whole life I've watched men build things while women kept them fed and clean and comfortable. And I was good at it. I'm still good at it. But I want... She stopped, searching for words that didn't sound childish. I want to build something. Not just maintain it, actually build it. This ranch is half broken, Caleb said quietly. You might be building it up just to watch it fall apart. Then at least I'll know I tried. Eliza met his eyes. At least I'll know I didn't spend my whole life making other people's dreams work while mine died quiet. Something shifted in Caleb's expression. Not pity, she would have hated pity, but recognition, like he understood exactly what she meant. I didn't want this place, he said after a moment. When my uncle wrote to me, said he was leaving me the ranch, I thought about refusing. I was in San Francisco, working for a shipping company, building a career. I had plans, and then... He gestured at the shack around them, at the papers spread between them. Then I came out here and realized that plans don't mean much when you're handed responsibility you didn't ask for. Do you regret it? Every day. He said it without hesitation. And then I wake up and see the land, see what this place could be if it was run right, and I think maybe... He stopped. Maybe this is where I'm supposed to be, even if I didn't choose it. They sat in silence, the lamp flickering between them, and Eliza felt something dangerous blooming in her chest. It wasn't just respect or partnership or shared purpose. It was something more personal, more complicated. She stood up quickly, gathering papers. It's late. I should get back before someone notices. Caleb stood too. Take the creek bed south, harder to track in the dark. When should we meet again? 2 nights from now, same time. Eliza nodded and moved toward the door, but Caleb's voice stopped her. Eliza. She turned. Thank you, he said quietly, for staying, for fighting, for... He gestured helplessly at the papers. All of this. Thank me when we win, she said. And if we don't? Then at least we'll lose together. She left before he could respond, stepping out into the cold night air and trying not to think about the look in his eyes or the way her heart was racing for reasons that had nothing to do with fear. The walk back was longer than the walk there, or maybe it just felt that way. By the time Eliza slipped back into the ranch house, it was past midnight and her legs were shaking from exhaustion. She checked the kitchen, Untouched, the men must have eaten cold leftovers and called it good, and locked herself in her room. The papers went back under the mattress. The ink-stained dress went into the laundry pile, and Eliza sat on her bed in the dark, trying to slow her breathing. This was getting complicated in ways she hadn't anticipated. The case against Harker was one thing. That was strategy and evidence and careful documentation. But the way Caleb had looked at her in the lamplight, the way her chest had tightened when he'd thanked her, that was something else entirely. She couldn't afford something else. Not here, not now, not when everything depended on staying focused and seeing this through. But the heart didn't care about strategy. And Eliza's heart, traitorous thing that it was, had started to care about more than just winning. The next 2 weeks were a careful dance of normalcy and subterfuge. By day, Eliza ran the household, cooking, cleaning, managing supplies with what little Harker hadn't stolen. By night, she met Caleb at the line shack, building their case one document at a time. The men started to notice the change in the food quality. With Eliza managing the real supply orders and Caleb approving them directly, the kitchen was finally getting what it paid for. The coffee was strong again, the meat wasn't half gristle, even the bread tasted like something worth eating. It was a small victory, but Eliza watched how the men responded. They worked harder, complained less, started treating her less like an intruder, and more like someone who belonged. Harker noticed too. She could see it in the way his jaw tightened when the men complimented her cooking, the way his eyes narrowed when Caleb signed off on a supply order without consulting him first. The pressure was building. And pressure, Eliza knew from experience, always found the weakest point to break through. It came on a Thursday night, 2 weeks and 3 days after she'd arrived. Eliza was in the kitchen finishing up after dinner when she heard shouting from the bunkhouse. Not the usual rough banter of tired men, but actual shouting. Angry voices rising above the general noise. She moved to the window and saw men pouring out into the yard, forming a loose circle around 2 figures. One was Monroe, the other was Tommy, the red-haired kid, and he was on the ground with blood streaming from his nose. Eliza ran outside without thinking, pushing through the circle of men. "What happened?" Monroe spat into the dirt. "Kid accused me of stealing, called me a liar in front of everyone." Tommy scrambled to his feet, wiping blood from his face. "Because you are a liar. That was my pay you took. I saw you going through the lockbox. You didn't see anything, you little—" "Enough!" Caleb's voice cut through the yard like a whip. He'd come from the barn, moving fast, and the authority in his voice made even Monroe pause. "Monroe, step back. Tommy, what are you talking about?" Tommy's hands were shaking, but he held his ground. "My pay was short this week. A full day's wages missing, and I saw Monroe near the lockbox yesterday when he thought nobody was watching." "That doesn't mean—" Monroe started. "Then let's check the box." Caleb's voice was cold. "Right now, everyone here as witnesses." The lockbox was kept in Harker's quarters, and Harker appeared now from the foreman's cabin, moving slow and deliberate. "Problem, boss?" he asked. "Tommy says his pay is short. I want to see the box." Harker's expression didn't change. "You think I can't count?" "I think mistakes happen. Let's make sure this isn't one." They moved to Harker's cabin, the whole crew following like this was theater and they had front row seats. Harker unlocked the box with exaggerated care and opened it. Inside were neat stacks of cash, already divided into envelopes with names written on them. Caleb reached for Tommy's envelope and counted it out slowly. "It's all here," he said finally. "Exact amount." Tommy's face went white. "But I counted it this morning, and—" "You counted wrong," Harker said smoothly. "Happens when you're young and excited about payday." The men started to disperse, muttering about wasted time and false accusations. But Eliza was watching Harker's face, and she saw it, the smallest flicker of satisfaction, the look of a man who'd just won something. She caught Tommy's arm as he started to slink away. "You're sure you counted right?" "Yes, ma'am. I know I did." His voice was miserable. "But it's there now, so I guess— I don't know. Maybe I did make a mistake. Or maybe someone fixed it real quick when they heard you making noise." Eliza kept her voice low. "Did you count it in front of anyone?" "No, Tommy stopped. "I counted it in the bunkhouse and told Davies it was short. He said I should check again before making accusations. So I went to find Monroe to ask if he'd seen anyone near the box, and that's when he gestured at his bloody nose. And between the time you counted and the time you confronted Monroe, how long? Maybe 20 minutes? Long enough for someone to hear about the complaint and slip the missing money back in. Long enough for Harker to make sure his man didn't get caught. Eliza let Tommy go and found Caleb standing by the barn, staring out at nothing. "He's playing games," she said quietly. "I know." The money was short. Tommy's not lying, but Harker made sure it was fixed before we checked, so now Tommy looks like a fool and everyone else is scared to speak up. Caleb's hands curled into fists. "I'm tired of games." "One more week, we're almost there." "A week is too long. He's stealing wages now, Eliza. Not just supplies. He's taking money directly from the men." "Which makes him desperate. Desperate people make mistakes." Eliza moved closer, lowering her voice even more. "We stick to the plan. One more week and we have everything we need to bury him. And if someone else gets hurt in the meantime, then we deal with it. But if we move now, we lose. And losing means he wins everything." Caleb looked at her, and she could see him wrestling with it. The need to act versus the discipline to wait. It was the same struggle she saw in the mirror every morning. "1 week," he said finally. "But after that, I'm done waiting." "1 week," Eliza agreed. But as she walked back to the house, she had the sinking feeling that neither of them was going to get a full week. Harker was escalating, testing boundaries, seeing how far he could push before Caleb pushed back. And when that confrontation finally came, someone was going to bleed. Eliza just hoped it wouldn't be her. That night she lay in bed listening to the sounds of the ranch and thinking about Tommy's bloody nose, Monroe's cold denial, Harker's satisfied smile, thinking about all the small cruelties that built up to something bigger, something that couldn't be ignored or documented or solved with evidence. Through the thin walls she heard footsteps, a door opening and closing, low voices that might have been argument or might have been nothing. The frontier was supposed to be about freedom, wide open spaces, fresh starts, the chance to be something more than what you'd been born to. But the longer Eliza stayed here, the more she realized it was just another kind of cage. Different bars, same trap. The only difference was that out here, you could see exactly who was holding the keys. And right now, Ben Harker thought he held all of them. But Eliza had spent her whole life picking locks that weren't supposed to open, and she was getting real good at finding the weak spots in other people's certainty. 1 more week, 7 days, then they'd see who really ran this ranch. And if Harker wanted a fight, Eliza would give him one he'd remember for the rest of his life, however long that turned out to be. The week didn't last. 3 days after the incident with Tommy's pay, Eliza was in the office going through the last of the supplier correspondence when she heard horses approaching fast. Not the usual steady pace of ranch work, but urgent, like someone was riding hard with news that couldn't wait. She moved to the window and saw Davies pulling up in front of the main house, his horse lathered and blowing. Caleb emerged from the barn and met him halfway, and even from a distance, Eliza could see the tension in both their postures. They talked for less than a minute. Then Caleb was striding toward the house with an expression that made Eliza's stomach drop. He didn't knock, just pushed open the office door and closed it behind him. "The north herd is gone," he said. Eliza stared at him. "Gone how?" "Someone cut the fence during the night and drove them off. Tracks head west toward the mountains. Davies found it this morning when he went to move them to fresh pasture." "How many head?" 42. Almost a quarter of our breeding stock." Caleb's voice was controlled, but barely. "That's $8,000 on the hoof, minimum. More if they were planning to sell them locally and undercut our prices." Eliza's mind was already racing through the implications. "Harker! Has to be. Nobody else knows the patrol schedule well enough to know when that pasture would be unwatched." "Can you prove it?" "The tracks lead west. Harker's brother runs a ranch about 30 miles that direction. I'd call that proof enough." Eliza set down the papers she'd been holding. "It's not proof that will hold up, not without witnesses or documentation. He'll just say it was rustlers, that he had nothing to do with it. Then I'll ride out there and get the cattle back myself." "Caleb, think. If you ride onto his brother's property making accusations, what do you think happens? Best case, they run you off. Worst case—" She stopped, not wanting to say it. "Worst case, I don't come back." Caleb's jaw was tight. I know, but I can't just let him steal from me and do nothing. You're not doing nothing. You're building a case that will destroy him permanently instead of just this month. Eliza moved closer, forcing him to look at her. This is what he wants. He wants you angry and reckless, wants you to make a move that gives him an excuse to push back harder. Don't give it to him. So I just let $8,000 walk away? No. You report it as theft, send Davies to the nearest town to file with the marshal, and you document everything. Make it official. Make it part of the pattern. Caleb turned away from her, bracing his hands against the desk. The marshal is 3 days away. By the time he gets here, those cattle will be sold and scattered. The evidence will be gone. But the theft will be on record. And when we bring our case against Harker, it's one more piece of proof that he's been working against you from the start. That doesn't get my cattle back. No, it doesn't. Eliza's voice softened. I know this isn't fair. I know it feels like losing, but fair doesn't exist out here, and losing a battle isn't the same as losing the war. Caleb was quiet for a long moment, and Eliza could see him fighting himself. The anger, the need for immediate justice, the knowledge that she was right, even when being right felt like surrender. Send Davies to town, he said finally. Have him file the report, but I'm not sitting here doing nothing while Harker celebrates. What are you going to do? Call a meeting. Tonight. All the hands. I want everyone to know what happened and who's responsible. Eliza's stomach clenched. That's dangerous. If you accuse Harker without proof, I'm not accusing him. I'm reporting a theft and making it clear that security is everyone's responsibility. Caleb straightened up and his eyes were hard. If Harker wants to defend himself, he can do it in front of the men he's been stealing from. It wasn't the worst idea Eliza had heard, but it wasn't the safest either. Still, she could see that Caleb needed this, needed to do something active instead of just documenting and waiting. All right, she said. But I'm there when you do it. Eliza, you don't need to... If this is about to blow up, I'm not finding out secondhand. We're in this together. She met his eyes. Remember? Something flickered across his face, gratitude, maybe, or relief that he wasn't alone in this. Together, he agreed. The meeting was called for after dinner, in the barn where there was enough room for everyone to gather. Word spread fast, and by the time Eliza finished cleaning up the kitchen, the tension in the air was thick enough to choke on. She walked to the barn with her heart hammering, very aware that she was the only woman heading into a space full of men who were about to be told their livelihood was under threat. Ruth had tried to warn her off earlier, saying this wasn't her fight, but Eliza had learned that everything on this ranch was her fight, whether she wanted it to be or not. The barn was packed. All the hands were there, plus a few seasonal workers Eliza hadn't met yet. They stood in loose groups, talking in low voices, glancing at Caleb, who stood near the front with his arms crossed. Harker was leaning against a support beam, looking completely unbothered, like this was just another tedious ranch meeting and he couldn't wait for it to be over. Caleb waited until everyone was settled, then stepped forward. Thank you all for coming. I'll keep this brief. This morning, Davies discovered that someone cut the north fence and drove off 42 head of our breeding stock. The tracks head west. I've sent Davies to file a theft report with the marshal, but I wanted you all to know what's happening. The barn erupted in angry voices. Men shouting questions, demanding to know how this could happen, asking what Caleb was going to do about it. Caleb held up a hand for quiet. I'm increasing patrols on all perimeters, effective immediately. Everyone pulls guard duty, rotating shifts. No pasture goes unwatched for more than 4 hours. That's going to stretch us thin, one of the older hands said. We're already short on sleep as it is. I know, but until we catch whoever did this, we can't afford to be careless. Caleb's voice was steady. This ranch depends on that breeding stock. Losing more could put us under. You think it's rustlers? Someone asked. I think it's someone who knows this ranch well enough to know when and where to hit us. Caleb let that hang in the air for a moment. Which means it's either someone on this crew or someone with inside information. The temperature in the barn dropped. Men started looking at each other with suspicion, and Eliza could see the unity Caleb had been trying to build fracturing in real time. Harker pushed away from the beam, his voice cutting through the noise. That's a serious accusation, boss. You saying one of us is a thief? I'm saying someone with knowledge of our operations stole from this ranch. If any of you have information about who that might be, now's the time to speak up. Silence. Heavy and hostile. Harker smiled. Seems like nobody knows anything, which means you're chasing ghosts. He addressed the crowd now, his voice reasonable and calm. Rustlers are a fact of life out here. Always have been. Best thing we can do is tighten security like Mr. Thornridge said and move on. Making accusations without proof just divides us when we need to stick together. It was a masterful deflection, and Eliza watched several men nodding in agreement. Harker was positioning himself as the voice of reason, while making Caleb look paranoid and inexperienced. Caleb's hands curled into fists at his sides, and Eliza knew he was about to say something that would make this worse. She stepped forward before he could. "Mr. Harker's right that we need to stick together," she said, her voice carrying across the barn. Which is why everyone should know that supply theft has also been an issue. Missing inventory, short deliveries, discrepancies in the account books. Every eye turned to her, and Eliza felt the weight of their attention like a physical thing. She kept her voice steady. "I've been reviewing the household accounts, and there are significant gaps between what we're paying for and what we're receiving. Someone's been skimming, and it's been going on for at least 2 years, maybe longer." The barn went deadly quiet. Harker's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes. "That's quite a claim, Miss Hartwell. You have proof?" "Documentation from multiple suppliers confirming short deliveries. Correspondence that directly contradicts the invoices in our ledgers. Testimony from vendors about secondary delivery locations." Eliza met his gaze directly. "Yes, I have proof." "Then maybe you should share it with all of us." Harker's voice was still calm, but there was an edge underneath now. "If someone's been stealing, the crew deserves to know who." It was a trap. If Eliza named Harker directly without Caleb's backing, she'd look like she was overstepping. If she didn't, she'd look like she was bluffing. Caleb stepped up beside her. "We'll be presenting the evidence to everyone once the investigation is complete. But Miss Hartwell is right. Theft isn't just about the cattle. It's been happening across the board, and it stops now." "Investigation." Harker said the word like it was something distasteful. "Seems like there's a lot of investigating going on and not much ranching. Maybe if you spent less time on paperwork and more time actually running this place, we wouldn't have these problems." It was insubordination, clear and direct, and the men knew it. The tension ratcheted up another notch. Caleb's voice went cold. "Careful, Ben. Just speaking truth." Harker spread his hands. "Your uncle ran this ranch for 30 years without all this drama. He trusted his foreman to handle things and focused on the work. Maybe that's a model worth following." "My uncle also died broke because someone was stealing him blind." Caleb's voice cut like a knife. "I'm not making that mistake." The words hung in the air, and Eliza saw the moment Harker's mask slipped. Just for a second, but it was enough. Pure rage flashed across his face before he got it under control. "That's a hell of a thing to say," Harker said quietly. "It's the truth. And if you've got a problem with the truth, there's the door." The barn was so quiet Eliza could hear her own heartbeat. This was it, the confrontation she'd been trying to avoid, happening too soon, too publicly, with too many witnesses. Harker looked around at the assembled men, calculating. Then he smiled that cold smile and touched his hat brim. "No problem here, boss. You're the owner. You run things how you see fit." He started toward the door, then paused. "But just so we're clear, when this investigation of yours turns up nothing, and when those cattle don't come back, and when the men start wondering if maybe the problem isn't theft, but incompetence, you remember who tried to warn you." He walked out, and 3 men followed him. Not Monroe. He stayed, looking uncertain, but 3 others who'd been with Harker since before Caleb arrived. The door swung shut behind them, and the remaining crew stood there in uncomfortable silence. Caleb addressed them directly. "Anyone else want to leave? Now's your chance. No hard feelings. But if you stay, you're committing to doing this right. Honest work for honest pay. No shortcuts, no stealing." Nobody moved. After a long moment, the older hand who'd spoken earlier cleared his throat. "We're with you, Mr. Thornridge. Just tell us what you need." The meeting broke up slowly, men drifting back to the bunkhouse in small groups, talking in low voices. Eliza waited until they were all gone before turning to Caleb. "That could have gone better. Could have gone worse, too." Caleb's voice was tight. "He'll be back. either with those men or with more. And when he comes, we'll be ready. Eliza kept her voice firm, even though her hands wanted to shake. We have the evidence now. We just need to present it right. When? Tomorrow night, at the line shack. I'll bring everything I have. We'll go through it one more time, make sure it's airtight, and then we call another meeting and lay it all out. Caleb nodded slowly. And if Harker doesn't give us until tomorrow night? Then we improvise. They walked back to the house together, neither speaking, both lost in their own thoughts. The ranch felt different now, charged, like the air before a lightning strike. Everything that had been simmering beneath the surface was boiling over, and there was no putting it back. Eliza locked herself in her room and pulled out all the documentation she'd been hiding. Spread across her bed were months of careful work, letters, invoices, ledger copies, witness statements from suppliers. It was damning, comprehensive, exactly what they needed to prove Harker had been systematically robbing the ranch. But it was also just paper. And paper couldn't stop a man who'd already proven he was willing to steal cattle in the night and terrorize employees into silence. She was still organizing the evidence when she heard footsteps outside her door. A pause, then a soft knock. Eliza? It's me. She opened the door to find Caleb standing there, looking exhausted and wired at the same time. Can I come in? It was improper. A man in her room, late at night, door closed. But propriety had stopped mattering somewhere around the second secret meeting in an isolated line shack. Yes. He stepped inside and she closed the door quietly. Caleb looked at the papers spread across her bed and let out a long breath. That's everything? Everything I could find. Supplier correspondence, ledger discrepancies, delivery records. It's all here. Caleb picked up one of the letters, read it, set it down. This is enough to have him arrested. If we had a marshal close enough to care. Out here, Eliza gestured at the window, at the empty land beyond. Out here, we're on our own. I know. Caleb turned to face her. Eliza, I need you to understand something. After tonight, Harker knows we're coming for him, which means he's going to push back, and it's not going to be subtle. If you want to leave, if you want to take the stage east and get clear of this, I'd understand. I'm not leaving. This isn't your fight. Yes, it is. Eliza moved closer, keeping her voice low. I made it my fight when I started digging into those books. When I stood up in that barn tonight and called out the theft. You don't get to protect me by sending me away. I'm not trying to protect you. I'm trying to give you an out before this gets ugly. It's already ugly, and I'm staying. They stood there in the lamplight, close enough that Eliza could see the worry in Caleb's eyes, the exhaustion, the weight of trying to hold together something that wanted to fall apart. Why? He asked quietly. Why are you willing to risk this much for a ranch that isn't even yours? Eliza could have given him the safe answer. About building things, about mattering, about all the reasons she'd used to justify her choices. But standing here in her room with papers spread between them and danger closing in, the truth came out easier. Because you asked what I wanted instead of telling me what I should do. Because you listened when I said I could help and you let me try. Because she stopped, searching for the right words. Because for the first time in my life, someone's treating me like a partner instead of a servant, and that's worth fighting for. Something shifted in Caleb's expression. Eliza, don't. She held up a hand. Whatever you're about to say, don't. Not now. Not when everything's about to explode and we need to stay focused. What if I can't stay focused? His voice was rough. What if every time I try to think about strategy or evidence or next moves, all I can think about is how you stood up in that barn and faced down 30 men without flinching? How you've been working yourself to exhaustion, building this case because you believe in something I'm not even sure I believe in anymore. Caleb, I'm serious. You came here expecting domestic work and instead you got war. And you didn't run. You didn't complain. You just... He gestured helplessly. You just kept fighting. And I don't know what to do with that. Eliza's heart was hammering. They were standing too close, the air between them charged with something dangerous, and she knew if she let this moment continue, it would change everything. But maybe everything needed to change. Tell me what you want, she said quietly. Caleb looked at her for a long moment. Then he reached up and touched her face, gentle, like he was afraid she might disappear. I want to stop pretending this is just about the ranch, he said. I want to stop lying to myself that the only reason I ride out to that line shack is to review evidence. He stopped, swallowed hard. I want you to know that you're not alone in this, that whatever happens tomorrow or the day after, we face it together. Not because you work for me, but because Eliza kissed him before he could finish, rising up on her toes and closing the distance between them. It wasn't gentle or tentative. It was desperate and honest, and 3 weeks of tension finally breaking through. Caleb's arms came around her immediately, pulling her closer, and for a moment the whole world narrowed to this. The warmth of his hands, the rough edge of his jaw against her palm, the way he held her like she was something precious. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Caleb rested his forehead against hers. "This is a terrible idea," he said. "I know. If anyone finds out, they'll find out eventually. This place doesn't keep secrets." Eliza pulled back enough to look at him. "But right now, I don't care. Right now, I just want to be honest about what this is." "What is it?" "I don't know yet, but it matters. And I'm tired of pretending it doesn't." Caleb kissed her again, softer this time, and Eliza let herself have this moment. Tomorrow they'd face Harker. Tomorrow they'd lay out the evidence and watch this whole thing either come together or fall apart. Tomorrow, there would be consequences and complications and all the reasons this was impossible. But tonight, in this room with the lamp burning low and the frontier wind rattling the windows, Eliza let herself believe that maybe impossible didn't mean hopeless. Caleb left an hour later, slipping out quietly, and Eliza lay in bed staring at the ceiling and trying not to think about all the ways this could destroy them both. She'd spent her whole life being careful, calculating risk, choosing the safe path even when it meant being invisible. But the safe path had led her to a factory job that was killing her slowly, to a city that didn't care if she lived or died, to a life that felt like waiting for permission to exist. The frontier wasn't safe. This ranch wasn't safe. Caleb wasn't safe. But for the first time in years, Eliza felt fully alive. And that was worth the risk. She fell asleep with her hand pressed against her lips, still feeling the ghost of Caleb's kiss, and dreamed of open land and impossible futures. The morning came too fast and too loud. Eliza dragged herself out of bed, splashed cold water on her face, and tried to look like someone who'd slept instead of someone who'd spent half the night replaying a kiss and the other half organizing evidence for war. Breakfast was tense. The men who'd followed Harker out of the barn last night didn't show up for the meal. Neither did Harker. The remaining crew ate quickly and left, nobody meeting Eliza's eyes. Caleb appeared long enough to grab coffee and disappeared again, heading out to supervise the new patrol schedule. They didn't speak beyond basic civilities, but Eliza caught the look he gave her, quick and weighted with everything they couldn't say out loud. She spent the day preparing, organizing the evidence into clear categories, writing out a timeline that even someone who couldn't read could follow, making copies of the most damning documents in case something happened to the originals. By mid-afternoon, she'd built a case that should have been enough to bury Harker twice over, but should and would were different things. And Eliza had learned not to count on justice before it actually arrived. She was in the kitchen starting dinner when Ruth appeared in the doorway, looking grim. "You need to hear this," Ruth said quietly. Eliza set down the knife she'd been using. "Hear what?" "Harker's been in the bunkhouse all afternoon talking to the men, telling them you and Thornridge are trying to pin your own incompetence on him. Saying the real reason supplies are short is because you're wasting money on fancy food and Thornridge is too soft to manage properly." Eliza's stomach dropped. "How many are listening?" "More than I'd like." Ruth crossed her arms. "He's good at this, Hartwell. Real good. Makes it sound reasonable, like he's just looking out for everyone's best interests. And the men, they're scared. Scared of losing their jobs, scared of change, scared of trusting someone new over someone who's been here forever." "What about you?" Ruth was quiet for a moment. "I think Harker's a snake. Always have. But snakes don't usually bite the hand that feeds them unless they're cornered. So the question is, what are you and Thornridge planning that's got him cornered?" Eliza measured her next words carefully. "We're planning to show everyone exactly what he's been doing. Tomorrow night, all the evidence, all the theft, everything." "And you think that'll work? You think showing them papers is going to override years of Harker telling them what to think?" It has to. But what if it doesn't? Ruth stepped closer. What if you lay out all your proof and half the crew still sides with Harker because change is scarier than theft? What then? It was the question Eliza had been avoiding. The possibility that even with overwhelming evidence, even with truth on their side, they could still lose because people chose comfort over justice. Then at least we tried, Eliza said quietly. Ruth shook her head. You really believe that? That trying counts for something even when you lose? Yes, because the alternative is doing nothing and watching him win by default. They stood there in the kitchen, two women who'd both learned the hard way that the frontier didn't care about fairness, and Ruth's expression softened slightly. You've got guts, Ruth said finally, but guts only take you so far. After that you need luck, and out here, luck's in short supply. She left, and Eliza turned back to dinner preparation with shaking hands. The potatoes needed peeling, the roast needed tending, the cornbread needed mixing. Normal things, everyday things, the kind of work that kept a ranch running whether there was war brewing or not. But she couldn't stop thinking about Ruth's question. What if the evidence wasn't enough? What if after all this work, all this risk, the men still chose Harker because he was familiar, and she and Caleb were not? She was still wrestling with that when Caleb appeared in the doorway, and one look at his face told her something was wrong. The marshal sent word, he said. He can't come out to investigate. Too busy with a range war 3 counties over. Says to file a written report, and he'll get to it when he can. Eliza felt the last piece of their safety net fall away. When he can, that could be weeks, or months, or never. Caleb's voice was flat. We're on our own. They looked at each other across the kitchen, and Eliza saw the same realization in his eyes that she felt in her chest. There was no cavalry coming, no outside authority to validate their case or enforce justice, just them and the evidence and a barn full of men who would have to choose sides. Tomorrow night, then, Eliza said, we show them everything and let them decide. And if they decide wrong? Eliza thought about Ruth's question, about guts and luck and all the things you couldn't control. She thought about the kiss last night and the way Caleb had looked at her like she was worth fighting for. Then we start over, she said. Somewhere else. But at least we'll start over together. Caleb crossed the kitchen in 3 strides and pulled her into his arms, holding her tight like she was an anchor in a storm. Eliza let herself lean into him just for a moment before the work of dinner pulled her back. Tomorrow night they'd face whatever came. Tomorrow night they'd either win or lose everything. But right now, in this kitchen with the late sun streaming through the windows and Caleb's arms around her, Eliza let herself believe they had a chance. Because belief was all they had left. And sometimes, in the vast and indifferent frontier, belief was enough to build something that lasted. Or enough to go down fighting. Either way, Eliza was done running. Tomorrow night never came. Eliza woke to the smell of smoke. For a confused moment, she thought she'd left something on the stove, but the acrid burn in her nostrils was wrong. Not cooking, not wood, but something chemical and deliberate. She stumbled out of bed, still half asleep, and threw open her door to find the hallway hazy with gray tendrils creeping along the ceiling. The barn was on fire. She ran outside in her nightdress, bare feet hitting cold dirt, and saw flames eating through the barn's north wall. Not the whole structure yet, but enough that the horses inside were screaming in panic, and men were pouring out of the bunkhouse in various states of undress, shouting over each other. Caleb was already there, organizing a bucket line from the well, his voice cutting through the chaos. Get those horses out, now! Tommy, Davies, side door, move! Eliza ran to join the bucket line, grabbing a pail and passing it down, her arms burning with the effort. Around her, men worked with desperate efficiency, but the fire was spreading faster than they could contain it. The whole barn was going to go. Tommy and Davies came out leading panicked horses, whites showing in their eyes, hooves dancing on the edge of bolting. Behind them, 2 more hands emerged with the draft team, but there were more horses inside, and the smoke was getting thicker. How many left? Caleb shouted. 4, Davies yelled back. Maybe 5. Caleb dropped his bucket and started toward the barn entrance, but Eliza grabbed his arm. You'll die in there. Those horses will die if I don't. He pulled free and ran inside before she could stop him. The next 3 minutes felt like 3 hours. Eliza kept passing buckets with mechanical precision while her heart tried to beat its way out of her chest, waiting for Caleb to emerge, praying he'd emerge, trying not to imagine what burning alive felt like. Then he was there, stumbling out with a horse on each side, coughing hard enough that his whole body shook. Monroe ran in behind him and came out with another. One more left. The roof groaned. Timbers started cracking with sounds like gunshots. "Everyone out!" Caleb shouted. "It's coming down!" They scattered just as the main beam gave way, collapsing inward with a roar that sent sparks fountaining into the pre-dawn sky. The horses they'd saved danced at the end of their leads, terrified but alive. The one they hadn't was gone. And the barn that had stood for 30 years, that held equipment and feed and the infrastructure the ranch needed to function, was burning like a funeral pyre. They worked until sunrise, containing the fire so it wouldn't spread to the other buildings, but there was no saving the barn itself. By the time the flames finally died down to smoldering embers, all that remained was a blackened skeleton and ash. The crew stood in a loose circle, staring at the ruins. Nobody spoke. What was there to say? Eliza found Caleb sitting on the ground near the well, his face streaked with soot, his hands blistered. She sat down next to him without asking. "Accident," he said flatly. "That's what Harker will call it. Lantern tipped over, dry hay. These things happen." "You don't believe that?" "Of course I don't believe it, but I can't prove it wasn't." He looked at her, and his eyes were hollow. "He's burning me out, Eliza. He can't steal the ranch directly, so he's destroying it piece by piece until there's nothing left worth owning. We still have the evidence. We can still—" "Evidence of theft doesn't matter if there's no ranch left to steal from." Caleb's voice cracked. "That barn had our winter feed, our equipment, tools we can't replace without going into town, and town is 3 days away. Even if we rebuild, it'll take months, and we don't have months. Winter's coming, and without shelter for the horses, without stored feed—" He stopped, pressing his palms against his eyes. "He's won. I just haven't admitted it yet." Eliza wanted to argue, wanted to tell him they could still fight, still win, still salvage something from this disaster. But looking at the smoking ruins and the exhausted men and the impossible math of rebuilding before winter, she couldn't find the words. Instead, she took his hand, his blistered, ash-stained hand that had pulled horses from a burning building, and she held it. They sat like that while the sun came up and painted the devastation in shades of gold and gray, and Eliza felt her carefully built hope crumbling like the barn's charred timbers. The men gathered after breakfast, what little breakfast there was, with supplies running low and morale lower. Caleb stood in front of them, and Eliza could see how much it cost him to keep his voice steady. "I know last night was hard. I know you're tired. But we need to make some decisions about what comes next." He paused. "I'm not going to lie to you. Losing the barn is a critical blow. We can rebuild, but it's going to take time and money and work we weren't planning on. If any of you want to move on, find work somewhere more stable. I understand. I'll give you good references and pay through the end of the month." The men shifted uncomfortably. A few exchanged glances. "But if you stay," Caleb continued, "I promise you this. We rebuild honest. We run this ranch the right way, with fair pay and straight dealing. No more looking the other way. No more tolerating theft or lies or shortcuts." "Easy to promise," Monroe said. "Harder to prove." "Then let me prove it." Caleb gestured to Eliza. "Miss Hartwell has been investigating supply discrepancies for the past 3 weeks. She's found evidence of systematic theft. Supplies ordered but not delivered, money paid but not received, operations run for someone's profit instead of the ranch's success. I was going to present this evidence tonight at a formal meeting, but given what happened—" He looked at the barn ruins. "Given what happened, I think you all deserve to see it now." Eliza's stomach clenched. This wasn't how they'd planned it. They were supposed to have time to organize, to present everything in a way that was clear and irrefutable. Doing it now, in the aftermath of disaster, felt desperate, but desperate was all they had left. She stood and pulled out the folder she'd been carrying since the fire started, wrapped in oilcloth to protect it from the smoke and water. Inside were copies of the most damning documents, the ones she'd made extras of just in case. "I have correspondence from 6 different suppliers," she said, her voice steady despite her racing heart. All of them confirmed that deliveries to this ranch have been consistently short by 30 to 40%. The difference was redirected to a secondary location at the foreman's request. She held up a letter. This is from the feed supplier in Billings, dated March of this year. He confirms that Ben Harker ordered him to deliver 200 pounds of grain here and the remaining 300 to a ranch 30 miles west. Harker's brother's ranch. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Eliza kept going. This is from the equipment supplier. Same pattern, short deliveries here, full payments made, different shipped elsewhere. She looked up, meeting the eyes of men who'd been skeptical of her since the day she arrived. The total theft over the past 2 years amounts to approximately $8,000. That's your pay, your food, your safety equipment. Stolen and sold for someone else's profit. That's a lie. Harker's voice cut through the crowd, and he stepped forward, his expression calm but his eyes hard. Those are fabrications, probably doctored by someone who doesn't understand how ranching works and is trying to cover up their own mistakes. Then explain the supplier testimony, Caleb said. Suppliers say what they're paid to say, or what someone threatens them into saying. Harker addressed the crowd directly. How convenient that Miss Hartwell shows up, starts digging into books she doesn't understand, and suddenly I'm the villain. How convenient that the barn burns down the night before she's supposed to present this supposed evidence, giving her an excuse to skip the formal process and just make accusations. The implication hung in the air like poison, that Eliza had burned the barn herself to create urgency, that she was the real threat. Several men were nodding. Harker had planted the seed well. I have witnesses, Eliza said, her voice sharp. Suppliers willing to testify. Documentation that goes back before I ever arrived here. Witnesses who will say whatever Thornridge pays them to say now that he's desperate. Harker smiled. Face it, boss. You're in over your head. You don't know how to run a ranch, so you're blaming your foreman instead of admitting you're not cut out for this. The cattle. Tommy spoke up suddenly, his voice shaking but determined. The ones that disappeared. I saw you riding west the morning before they went missing. You said you were checking fence lines, but the west pasture wasn't on your route that week. Harker's eyes narrowed. You calling me a liar, kid? I'm saying I saw what I saw. What you saw was me doing my job, just like I saw you counting your pay wrong and making a fool of yourself in front of everyone. Harker's voice was pleasant, but the threat underneath was clear. Seems like you're not very good at seeing things accurately. Tommy's face went red, but he didn't back down. I know what I saw. So do I. Ruth stepped forward from the back of the crowd, and Eliza's heart leaped. I saw you in the supply shed last month, repackaging flour into smaller sacks. When I asked what you were doing, you said you were checking for weevils. But there were no weevils. You were dividing supplies to skim the difference. That's ridiculous, Harker said, but his voice had lost some of its certainty. Is it? The older ranch hand, the one who'd been here longest, cleared his throat. Because I've been wondering for a while why our feed orders kept going up but the bins kept running empty. Started thinking maybe we had a rat problem. But rats don't usually drive wagons west. More men were nodding now. The tide was starting to turn. Harker saw it too. His expression shifted, the mask of reasonableness slipping to show the calculation underneath. You believe what you want, he said. But I've been running this ranch for 15 years, and it was profitable until Thornridge showed up with his city ideas and his inexperience. You want to throw that away because some housekeeper waves papers around and makes accusations? Fine. But when this place goes under, don't come crying to me. He turned to leave, and Caleb's voice stopped him. You're fired, Ben. Effective immediately. You have 1 hour to collect your things and get off my property. Harker turned back slowly. You sure you want to do that, boss? Because half these men are loyal to me, not you. You fire me, you might find yourself without a crew. Then that's their choice. Caleb's voice was steady. But they'll make it knowing the truth. For a long moment, Harker and Caleb stared at each other, and Eliza could feel the weight of 15 years pressing against 6 months. Experience against ownership, old ways against new. Then Harker smiled. That cold, empty smile that Eliza had learned to hate. 1 hour, he said. More than generous. He looked at the assembled men. Anyone with sense will come with me. I've got connections. Can find work for good hands, better work than rebuilding a ranch that's already dead. He walked away, and 3 men followed him immediately, the same ones who'd left the meeting in the barn. Monroe hesitated, looking between Harker's retreating back and Caleb's steady presence, then stayed put. The rest watched Harker go in silence. When he was out of earshot, the older hand spat into the dirt. Good riddance. Man's been a snake since the day he got here. Your uncle just didn't want to see it. Why didn't anyone say anything? Caleb asked quietly. Because we needed the work more than we needed justice. The man's voice was tired, and because speaking up against someone with that much power is a good way to end up unemployed. Or worse. It was the truth Eliza had been living with since she'd arrived, that survival and integrity were often opposing forces, and most people chose survival because at least it kept you breathing. Things are different now, Caleb said. If you're staying, you'll be treated fair, paid on time, worked honest, listened to when you speak up. I'm still learning how to run this place, and I'll make mistakes, but they'll be honest mistakes. That's the best I can offer. The men looked at each other. Then one by one, they nodded. We're in, Monroe said, but we're going to need a plan. Can't run a ranch without a barn. I know. Caleb took a breath. Here's what I'm thinking. We rebuild the barn in stages, get a basic structure up before the first snow, finish the rest in spring. In the meantime, we convert the southern shed into temporary stabling. It'll be cramped, but it'll work. We'll need to pool labor, everyone pitching in on construction and ranch work both. What about supplies? Davies asked. Building materials, feed, equipment to replace what burned. I'll ride to town tomorrow. Take out a loan against the property if I have to. It'll put us in debt, but it's better than losing everything. Caleb looked at Eliza. Miss Hartwell will handle the ordering and accounting. Everything documented, everything transparent. Anyone wants to review the books? They can ask. It wasn't a perfect plan. It wasn't even a good plan, but it was honest, and after weeks of lies and manipulation, honest felt like something worth building on. The meeting broke up with men heading off to start salvage work, pulling usable materials from the barn ruins, beginning the long process of recovery. Eliza found herself standing next to Caleb, both of them staring at the wreckage. We did it, she said quietly. We started to do it. There's a long way between firing Harker and actually rebuilding. I know, but it's a start. As Caleb looked at her, and something in his expression made her breath catch. I couldn't have done this without you. You know that, right? If you hadn't found the evidence, hadn't stood up in front of everyone, you would have found another way. Eliza kept her voice light, even though her heart was hammering. You're stubborn like that. Stubborn and incompetent, according to Harker. Harker's gone. His opinion doesn't matter anymore. They stood in silence for a moment, and then Caleb took her hand. Right there, in broad daylight, where anyone could see. It was a declaration, quiet but unmistakable. I know this isn't what you signed up for, he said. Burning barns, accusations, fighting wars you shouldn't have to fight. If you want to leave, catch the next stage east, I'd understand. I'd even pay for the ticket. Eliza looked at their joined hands, at the ranch spread out around them, at the men working together to salvage something from disaster. I didn't come 2,000 miles to run away the first time things got hard, she said. Besides, someone needs to make sure you don't order supplies from the wrong vendors. Caleb laughed, a surprise sound that seemed to catch him off guard. Just the supplies? Well, someone also needs to make sure you eat and sleep and don't work yourself to death trying to rebuild in a month. Eliza squeezed his hand. I'm staying, Caleb. For however long you'll have me. That might be a very long time. Good. They stood like that, hand in the ruins of the barn, and Eliza felt something settle in her chest. Not quite peace, the frontier didn't allow for peace, but purpose, direction. The sense that she was exactly where she was supposed to be, doing exactly what she was meant to do. The next 3 months were brutal. They rebuilt the barn in sections, working dawn to dusk 7 days a week. Caleb took out a loan that made Eliza's stomach hurt when she saw the numbers, but it bought them materials and time. The men worked harder than she'd thought possible, driven by the knowledge that their survival depended on finishing before the first heavy snow. Eliza managed the household and the books simultaneously, stretching supplies, finding cheaper vendors. documenting everything with an obsessive precision that made Ruth laugh and call her a tyrant. But the ranch ran smoother than it had in years. Food was plentiful. Pay came on time. When equipment broke, it got fixed instead of jury-rigged until it failed completely. Word spread that the Thornridge Ranch was under new management, and applications started coming in from hands looking for honest work. Not many. The frontier was full of men who preferred Harker's way of doing business, but enough. By the time winter set in, they had a full crew in a barn that, while not beautiful, was functional. Harker disappeared. Rumor said he'd moved to his brother's ranch, or maybe further west, or maybe he'd left ranching entirely. Eliza didn't care as long as he stayed gone. The ranch survived the winter. Barely, but barely was enough. And when spring came and the snow melted and the land turned green again, Eliza stood in the kitchen garden watching new growth push through old soil and felt something she hadn't felt in years. Hope. Not the desperate, grasping hope that had brought her west, not the fragile hope that someone else would fix things, but the solid, earned hope that came from building something with your own hands and watching it stand. Caleb found her there, dirt under her fingernails, hair escaping from its pins. "The new foals are strong," he said. "Breeding program's going to pay off. Another year or two, we'll be selling quality stock." "That's good. The supply accounts balanced perfectly last month. First time since I inherited this place." "I know, I did them myself." "Did them?" He smiled. "I'm aware." He paused. "Eliza, I need to ask you something." She looked up at him. This man who'd given her a choice when no one else would, who'd fought beside her when he could have sent her away, who'd trusted her competence when the world told him not to. "I'm listening," she said. "This arrangement, you managing the household, handling the books, working yourself half to death, keeping this place running, it's not sustainable. You're doing 3 jobs for the pay of 1, and it's not fair." Eliza's stomach dropped. After everything, was he going to let her go? Replace her with someone who cost less, demanded less, complicated his life less? "So I'm proposing a partnership," Caleb continued. "Legal, documented, formal. You get a percentage of profits, decision-making authority, your name on the paperwork, equal say in how this ranch runs." Eliza stared at him. "A partnership? Unless you want something else." "Well, something else like what?" Caleb took her hand and his eyes were steady. "Like a marriage. If you're willing. If that's something you'd want." The garden was very quiet. Somewhere in the distance, a horse whinnied. Closer, she could hear men working, talking, living their lives on a ranch that was finally becoming what it was supposed to be. "People will talk," Eliza said quietly. "They'll say I married you for the ranch, for security, that I calculated my way into ownership. Let them talk. We know the truth." "Do we?" Eliza looked down at their joined hands. "What is the truth, Caleb? That I came here broke and desperate? That you gave me a chance because you were too inexperienced to know better? That we fell into this because we were both lonely and scared and fighting the same war? The truth is that you're the smartest, strongest, most competent person I've ever met. The truth is that this ranch works because of you. The truth is that I don't want to do this, any of this, without you." He paused. "And the truth is that I love you. Not because you're useful, not because you saved my ranch, but because you're you, and that's enough." Eliza felt tears prick her eyes, and she didn't try to hide them. "I love you too. Even when you're stubborn and reckless, and you ride into burning barns without thinking." "So is that a yes?" "That's a yes to the partnership and the marriage both, because I want my name on those papers, and I want it next to yours." Caleb pulled her into his arms and kissed her there in the garden, with dirt under their feet and possibilities spreading out around them like the land itself. They were married a month later in the ranch house, with the crew as witnesses and Ruth standing up as Eliza's attendant, because somewhere along the way, the bitter woman from the bunkhouse had become something like a friend. It wasn't a fancy wedding. There were no flowers except what grew wild, no music except what someone played on a battered harmonica, no guests except the people who'd helped them survive. But it was real, and it was theirs, and that was all Eliza needed. The ranch grew over the years, slowly at first, then with increasing momentum, as word spread that the Thorn Ridge operation was run fair and ran well. They expanded the herd, improved the breeding program, brought in new methods that Caleb learned from books, and Eliza refined through practice. They had children, 2 daughters who grew up knowing how to ride and shoot and balance ledgers, who were taught that competence mattered more than compliance, that asking questions was strength instead of weakness. They had setbacks too. Droughts and hard winters, market crashes and accidents, all the 1,000 disasters that came with trying to tame land that refused to be tamed. But they faced them together, with the same stubborn determination that had gotten them through that first terrible year. Ruth stayed on, eventually becoming the head of household operations when her joints got too stiff for field work. Tommy grew into a solid ranch hand and then a foreman, the kind who earned respect through fairness instead of fear. Monroe left after a few years, but most of the others stayed, building lives on land that finally felt like it belonged to everyone who worked it. Eliza never forgot what it felt like to arrive at this ranch with nothing but a carpet bag and desperate hope, to be assigned to work she hadn't agreed to stand in a barn surrounded by men who saw her as a problem to be solved. She made sure no one else who came to work here felt that way. Every new hire got a choice about their duties. Every complaint got heard. Every person got treated like they mattered. It wasn't perfect. The frontier didn't allow for perfect, but it was better, and better was enough to build on. Caleb died in his 70s, peacefully in his sleep, with Eliza holding his hand. She grieved him deeply and honestly, but she didn't fall apart. She'd spent too many years being strong to forget how now. She ran the ranch for another decade on her own, with her daughters helping, until her body finally told her it was time to step back. By then, the youngest daughter had married a man with good sense and a head for business, and together they took over operations while Eliza moved into the small house they'd built for her near the main ranch. She spent her final years in that house, watching her grandchildren learn to ride, watching the ranch continue to grow and change and adapt, watching the legacy she and Caleb had built ripple outward in ways they'd never imagined. When people asked her about those early days, about Harker and the fire, and the fight that had defined everything that came after, she told the truth. Not a sanitized version where everything was noble and clear, but the real truth. That she'd been terrified, that she'd made mistakes, that there were nights she'd wanted to run and mornings she'd doubted everything. But she'd stayed, and staying had made all the difference. Eliza Hartwell Thornridge died at 83, surrounded by family, on land she'd helped build into something lasting. Her daughters inherited the ranch and ran it well, passing it down to their own children, who passed it to theirs. The frontier that had been so hostile, so unforgiving, so determined to break anyone who dared to hope, that frontier was tamed eventually. Not conquered, because land like that didn't get conquered, but tamed enough that people could build lives that lasted. And buried in the ranch's foundation, in the choices that had been made and the precedents that had been set, was Eliza's legacy. Not just the buildings or the profit margins or the breeding program that was still going strong 100 years later, but the idea that people deserved choices, that competence mattered more than tradition, that a woman who showed up with nothing but determination and intelligence could build something that outlasted her, that the frontier, for all its cruelty and indifference, could be reshaped by people stubborn enough to believe it was possible. The ranch still stood, generations after Eliza's death. The barn had been rebuilt twice more, expanded and modernized, but they'd kept one of the original support beams, scarred and smoke-stained from that first fire, and mounted it over the main entrance with a plaque. The plaque read, "Built by Eliza and Caleb Thornridge, 1875. Rebuilt with sweat, hope, and the stubborn belief that better was possible." And for everyone who passed beneath it, family, workers, visitors from the modern world who could barely imagine what this place had been, that beam stood as proof that one woman's refusal to accept what she'd been assigned, one man's willingness to trust her competence, and their shared determination to build something fair in a place that didn't believe in fairness, that all of it had mattered, that it had lasted, that it had changed not just a ranch, but the idea of what a ranch could be, and that sometimes, in the vast and indifferent frontier, choosing to fight for something better was enough to make better real. The land remembered, the buildings remembered, and the people who still worked that soil, who still ran cattle across those fields, who still gathered around tables to discuss fair pay and honest dealing, they remembered too. Not because it had been perfect, not because it had been easy, but because Eliza Hartwell had shown up broke and desperate and refusing to be invisible, and she'd built something that proved one person's choice could echo through generations. That was the real legacy, not the land or the money or even the family name, but the stubborn, magnificent truth that dignity and choice and partnership could thrive even in the harshest conditions if someone was brave enough to demand them. And Eliza had been brave enough. For all of them.